For centuries, humanity was seen as weak and insignificant. A short-lived species from a turbulent world. Emotion-driven. Politically fragmented. Chronically unstable. In the archives of the Galactic Council, Earth occupied a narrow column of unremarkable data. Moderate intelligence, inconsistent cooperation, low strategic priority. Humanity's early attempts at interstellar presence were hesitant and uneven, marked by internal disputes that never seemed to fully resolve. To an ancient galaxy that valued order and predictability, humans appeared unfinished. Ignored by the galaxy. Dismissed by those in power. The Council had learned, over millennia, what real danger looked like. Dangerous civilizations expanded aggressively. They announced themselves with conquest fleets, ideological crusades, or demands for recognition. Humanity did none of that. They argued among themselves. Failed publicly. Rebuilt slowly. Their progress came in fits and starts, interrupted by crises they seemed uniquely skilled at creating. To the Council, this meant safety. No one realized how dangerous that assumption was. Because humanity did not develop under stability. They developed under pressure. Their history was a continuous rehearsal for collapse. Financial systems failing overnight, governments dissolving under their own weight, alliances shattering at the worst possible moments. Every generation learned the same lesson: nothing lasts, and no authority is permanent. Survival was not guaranteed. It was engineered. So when humanity finally encountered the wider galaxy, they did not arrive with entitlement or ambition. They observed, listened, studied how power truly functioned beyond speeches and charters. They noticed something unsettling. The galaxy did not rule through strength. It ruled through balance. A balance enforced by trade access, political legitimacy, and the quiet threat of isolation. Species that cooperated thrived. Species that resisted were not crushed, they were excluded. Slowly, efficiently, invisibly. Humanity understood this instinctively. When formal contact began, it was deliberately unremarkable. Requests were filed properly. Protocols followed precisely. No urgency. No defiance. No attempt to stand out. Humanity behaved exactly as a minor, manageable civilization was expected to behave. And the Council stopped paying attention. Decades passed. Human space grew quieter. Less visible. Less demanding. To the Council, it appeared humanity had accepted its place, another small civilization stabilized by limits it would never overcome. They believed the balance of power was intact. They believed the system was working. They never asked why humanity stopped trying to influence it. They never wondered what a species becomes when it stops competing for approval and starts preparing for failure. They never noticed that human silence was not retreat, but discipline. By the time irregularities began to surface, trade flows behaving oddly, sensor data returning subtle inconsistencies, regions of space no longer aligning with predictive models, the Council dismissed them as noise. Systems drifted all the time. The balance always corrected itself. Until it didn't. Because the balance of power does not collapse with an explosion. It collapses when one side stops believing in it. And as the Galactic Council would soon learn, too late to intervene, too late to adapt, the most dangerous moment in any system is not when power is challenged loudly, but when it is quietly rendered irrelevant. That was the moment the balance of power began to fail. And humanity had been preparing for it all along. The Galactic Council tightened its grip. Not with warships or public decrees. Those were blunt instruments, reserved for visible threats. Humanity was handled the way the Council handled imbalances, quietly, methodically, and with absolute confidence in the outcome. First came the trade restrictions. Human shipping corridors were flagged for extended compliance audits. Docking permissions stalled without explanation. Insurance networks quietly reclassified human vessels as elevated risk, collapsing commerce without a single law being openly violated. Trade was cut. Critical imports slowed, then vanished. Medical compounds. Advanced alloys. Precision components. Peripheral colonies felt it first, then the core worlds. Prices rose. Shortages spread. Council economists watched the projections with calm certainty. They had seen this pattern many times. Scarcity bred unrest. Unrest bred division. Division restored balance. Then came the legal severance. Rights were revoked. Human representatives lost access to council chambers. Observer status was suspended under deliberately vague language, pending reassessment. Information networks that once returned open data now delivered filtered fragments or silence. Travel permits expired and were not renewed. Diplomatic channels collapsed into automated acknowledgments. Humanity was not condemned. It was removed. Isolation followed. No fleets blockaded Earth. No weapons darkened human skies. The Council did not need force. They simply removed humanity from the systems that maintained the galactic balance, trade, arbitration, legitimacy, and waited. Humanity was pushed into isolation with the assurance of an authority that had done this many times before. The Council expected collapse. They expected internal fractures to resurface under pressure. Expected colonies to hoard resources. Expected governments to turn on one another as scarcity deepened. Expected desperation to restore compliance. Timelines were filed. Months to instability. 1 year to unrest. 2 years to submission. But the collapse never came. Instead, something quietly destabilizing occurred. Human systems stabilized. Emergency protocols activated before shortages peaked. Manufacturing priorities shifted without public debate. Rationing was implemented efficiently and calmly. There were no mass riots. No planetary secessions. Human communication traffic surged, but not with outrage. With coordination. Old rivals shared data without treaties. Disputes were shelved, not resolved, but rendered irrelevant. The Council flagged the anomaly. Then dismissed it. They mistook restraint for denial. What they failed to understand was that humanity had lived this before. Economic crashes. Political implosions. Environmental catastrophes. Systems failing when they were needed most. Isolation was not shocking. It was familiar. Humanity did not demand reinstatement. Did not appeal to council morality. Did not threaten retaliation. They did something far more destabilizing. They adapted. Trade rerouted inward. Local industries expanded into roles once outsourced to the galaxy. Older technologies were revived, redesigned, and scaled beyond what council regulations had ever permitted. Every rule was followed, perfectly. Every clause obeyed to the letter. Every loophole used without violating a single statute. Sanctions meant to isolate human space began rippling outward, destabilizing council-aligned economies that had quietly relied on human adaptability. The Council waited for fracture. It never came. Instead, human space grew quieter, more ordered, more deliberate. Reports began noting a troubling trend. Humanity was becoming self-sufficient. Less responsive to pressure. Less dependent on approval. Less affected by authority that only functioned when it was believed in. Containment had always restored balance because species feared isolation. Humanity did not. They treated it as a condition to engineer around. And somewhere deep in the Council's projections, a realization began to surface, one no one wanted to articulate. The balance of power had not been reinforced. It had been undermined. Because you cannot maintain balance when one side stops depending on the system that enforces it. And humanity had just taken its first irreversible step away from the balance the Council believed was eternal. Isolation was supposed to restore equilibrium. That was the Council's belief. History supported it. When a civilization was cut off from trade, legitimacy, and external support, it fractured. Old rivalries resurfaced. Cooperation decayed into competition. The balance of power always corrected itself. Humanity should have broken. It didn't. Isolation didn't break humanity. It unified them. At first, the change was subtle enough to escape notice. Political rhetoric softened. Ideological battles that had raged for generations began to lose relevance. Leaders who thrived on division found their audiences shrinking, not because people agreed, but because argument no longer mattered. When the last sanctioned trade routes went dark, humanity stopped asking who was right. They started asking who would survive. Old divisions vanished. Not erased. Not forgiven. Set aside. Borders remained on maps, but they stopped dictating behavior. Rival governments paused conflicts that had lasted centuries, without treaties, without ceremonies, without victory speeches. Humanity did not celebrate unity. They defaulted to it. Because isolation stripped away illusion. There was no higher authority to appeal to. No external stabilizer to rely on. No council fleet arriving to enforce order if things went wrong. Humanity was alone. And once that truth settled in, priorities aligned with ruthless clarity. Emergency councils formed across Earth and its colonies, but instead of expanding bureaucracy, they dismantled it. Redundant authorities were merged or discarded. Decision chains were shortened. Not centralized for domination, but streamlined for speed. What emerged wasn't an empire. It was coordination. For the first time in human history, every major colony operated under a single operational framework. Not built on ideology. Not culture. Not ambition. Survival. All colonies stood under one command. It wasn't a throne or a singular ruler. It was a system, lean, adaptive, intolerant of inefficiency. Authority became situational. Whoever had the clearest data and the fastest response acted. Prestige evaporated. Ego became a liability overnight. Logistics became power. Supply chains that once competed synchronized across systems. Manufacturing priorities aligned without negotiation. Research institutions opened archives sealed for generations, sharing breakthroughs once guarded by profit, secrecy, or pride. Humanity stopped optimizing against itself. They optimized for endurance. Military forces changed, not in scale, but in purpose. Fleets once designed to deter rivals were restructured to protect infrastructure, evacuation corridors, and population centers. Training doctrine abandoned decisive victories in favor of prolonged survival under catastrophic conditions. Humanity stopped planning for wars they hoped to win. They planned for disasters they intended to outlast. Civilians were folded into preparedness without ceremony. Engineers trained for emergency repair. Medics drilled for mass casualty scenarios. Colonists learned redundancy protocols as naturally as daily routines. Every person became part of the system, not as a soldier, but as a stabilizing component. Humanity did not militarize its population. It prepared it. Then came the silence. No protests. No defiant broadcasts. No pleas sent into the void. Human communication traffic actually decreased, even as coordination reached levels no external observer had ever recorded. Unity did not make humanity louder. It made them efficient, focused, unsettlingly calm. Council analysts misread the data. Silence had always meant submission before. They believed humanity had accepted isolation. That exclusion had taught them humility and restored balance. In truth, isolation had taught humanity clarity. They stopped measuring success by recognition or inclusion. They measured it by resilience. By how well systems held under pressure. By how little external approval mattered when survival was at stake. Isolation did what no treaty ever had. It forced humanity to see itself as a single organism. Every colony understood its role. Every fleet knew its purpose. Every citizen knew what was at stake. If no one else would protect them, they would protect themselves. Not out of anger. Not out of defiance. Out of necessity. And in that quiet, deliberate moment, unnoticed by those who believed balance could only be maintained from above, the balance of power began to collapse. Because a system built on dependency fails the instant one civilization learns how to live without it. And humanity had just crossed that line. In silence, humanity evolved. There were no announcements. No declarations meant to reassert relevance. No signals sent into the void demanding recognition. Humanity had learned that attention invited interference, and interference invited control. So they worked where no one was looking. Isolation stripped away distraction. Research institutions that once competed for prestige and funding were reorganized into cooperative networks. Projects stalled by politics were revived out of necessity. Engineers stopped designing for ideal conditions and began designing for inevitability, assuming systems would fail, supply lines would vanish, and help would never arrive. New engines came first. Not engines built to outrun rivals or project dominance, but to endure. Drives capable of operating for years without resupply. Propulsion systems tolerant of damage, inefficiency, and improvised repair. Human ships sacrificed elegance for reliability, favoring designs that could limp forward instead of dying spectacularly. They could travel farther without support. They could remain operational without permission. They no longer needed the balance to move. Then came the shields. Galactic doctrine favored singular, overwhelming barriers, immense constructs that either held perfectly or failed catastrophically. Humanity rejected that philosophy entirely. They layered everything. Adaptive fields that reshaped under stress. Redundant systems that degraded gradually instead of collapsing all at once. Structural composites that absorbed force rather than attempting to negate it outright. Human shields were not invincible. They were persistent. They bent. They cracked. They kept working. Weapons followed, but quietly. Humanity did not chase extinction-level firepower or theatrical superweapons. They focused on systems that functioned after prolonged isolation. Weapons that could be repaired in deep space by exhausted crews with limited tools. Human weapons were not impressive. They were dependable. And then there were the fleets. They were not assembled in vast, centralized shipyards that could be observed, catalogued, and neutralized. Production was distributed across dozens of systems. Hull sections fabricated in civilian industries. Components built to common standards, modular, interchangeable, resilient. No single ship mattered. No single loss could cripple the whole. Fleets were built not for conquest, but survival. Naval doctrine evolved alongside them. Ships were designed to operate independently, cut off from command, guided by shared principles rather than constant instruction. Crews were cross-trained relentlessly. Every officer understood logistics. Every technician understood emergency repair. Human fleets assumed chaos as the baseline. Loss of communication. Overwhelming odds. Extended isolation. They trained until those conditions felt routine. The galaxy noticed nothing. Council sensors detected no alarming mobilization. No aggressive maneuvers. No treaty violations. Human space appeared quiet, constrained, irrelevant. Exactly as intended. While the galaxy looked away, humanity prepared. Not for retaliation. For inevitability. Human simulations grew darker. Scenarios assumed hostile powers, collapsing alliances, and enemies immune to diplomacy. Victory was redefined. Not defeat the enemy. Ensure continuation. If a colony survived, the mission succeeded. If a fleet endured catastrophic loss and still functioned, the mission succeeded. If humanity remained, everything else was secondary. Command structures flattened. Authority became situational. Any unit could assume control. Any plan could be abandoned instantly if reality demanded it. Humanity stopped fearing failure. They learned to absorb it. The Council, reviewing outdated reports, concluded humanity had stagnated. That isolation had capped their growth. That the balance had held. They were wrong. Humanity had not slowed. They had finished building. What remained was refinement. Stress testing. Quiet positioning beyond assumption and observation. And when the galaxy finally looked back, when something emerged that authority could not regulate and balance could not contain, it would not find a fragile civilization waiting to collapse. It would find a species that had spent years preparing for a universe where stability was temporary and survival was earned. Because while the Council watched the balance of power, humanity was learning how to exist without it. And that was when the balance truly began to fall apart. The first warning came as absence. A frontier system failed to transmit its routine status report. No distress signal. No debris. No trace of battle. Council analysts logged it as a relay malfunction and reassigned the sensors. Border systems failed all the time. The balance corrected itself. Then another system went dark. Then another. By the time unauthorized evacuation routes filled with fleeing ships, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Refugees arrived damaged and overcrowded, carrying fragmented sensor data, corrupted recordings, and a single name spoken with exhausted certainty. The Dominion. They did not announce themselves. They did not negotiate. They arrived. The Dominion was not a coalition or a crusade. It was an empire designed for expansion, every doctrine refined for speed, efficiency, and permanence. Their fleets advanced with mechanical precision, overwhelming defenses before panic could organize into resistance. Worlds fell. Orbital platforms were neutralized in minutes. Planetary shields collapsed under sustained, methodical pressure. Defense fleets were dismantled in sequence, not in heroic last stands, but in clean, clinical operations that left no room for improvisation. Infrastructure was seized intact. The Dominion did not seek destruction. They sought ownership. Species were enslaved, not exterminated, catalogued. Populations were sorted by utility. Administrators were retained under supervision. Labor forces reassigned. Entire cultures reduced to productivity metrics and compliance thresholds. Resistance was not punished publicly. It was removed. Quietly. Efficiently. Permanently. Fear spread faster than the invasion itself. Council-aligned task forces were deployed, veteran fleets armed with technologies that had enforced the balance of power for millennia. They engaged the Dominion and vanished. Not in spectacular explosions, but in silence. Signals cut off mid-transmission. Formations dissolved without explanation. The Dominion studied, adapted, and advanced. And still, the Council argued. Emergency assemblies convened and collapsed into procedural paralysis. Ancient rivalries resurfaced. Voting blocs stalled action. Committees debated jurisdiction, response thresholds, and proportional force while live feeds showed cities burning and evacuation corridors failing. Some delegates called for negotiation. Others demanded sanctions. A few proposed sacrifice, ceding outer systems to preserve the core. Time was something the Dominion did not allow. As invasion fronts pushed inward, the balance of power fractured. Member species recalled fleets to defend their own worlds. Mutual defense treaties were reinterpreted, delayed, or quietly ignored. Trade collapsed as fear overrode obligation. The Council could recommend. It could debate. It could not act. Within cycles, the unthinkable became undeniable. The Galactic Council, the institution that had defined balance for ages, was losing. That was when the chamber fell silent. Someone said the name no one wanted to hear. Humanity. The objections came immediately. Humanity was isolated, sanctioned, removed from the balance. Their fleets were undocumented. Their technology unverified. Their civilization, by Council projections, should have fractured long ago under exclusion. But others remembered. Human space had gone quiet years before the Dominion appeared. No collapse. No refugee waves. No desperate appeals for reintegration. Just absence, orderly, deliberate absence. Reluctantly, the Council authorized contact. The message was careful, polite, urgent without sounding desperate. It spoke of shared survival, collective defense, and the need to restore balance against an existential threat. It did not mention sanctions. It did not include apologies. Humanity received it. They did not respond immediately. While Council worlds burned, humanity analyzed. Dominion fleet movements. Tactical doctrine. Logistics throughput. Behavioral patterns. They compared the invasion against internal simulations, some of which matched with unsettling precision. The Council expected panic. They received silence. Hours passed. Then days. Another system fell, close enough to the Council core that evacuation alerts echoed through the chamber itself. Delegates who had argued procedural nuance moments earlier now pleaded openly for intervention. When humanity finally replied, the response was calm, measured, almost disquieting in its restraint. They acknowledged the Dominion threat. They confirmed the Council's defenses would fail. They stated, plainly, that humanity possessed the capability to intervene. There was no promise of rescue, only assessment. The Council protested, invoked shared destiny, demanded urgency, reminded humanity that the balance of power, and the galaxy itself, was collapsing. Humanity did not hurry, because the truth had become unavoidable. The Council had believed balance was maintained by authority, by inclusion, by control. The Dominion proved otherwise. It ignored authority. It bypassed balance. It consumed systems faster than debate could respond. And the only civilization that had prepared for a universe where balance failed was the one that had been pushed outside of it. With no leverage remaining and no illusions left to defend, the Galactic Council did something it had not done in its entire existence. It stopped trying to manage the crisis, and instead it asked, not as an authority, not as a stabilizer, but as a witness to its own collapse. They turned to humanity, because when the balance of power failed, when tradition meant nothing and procedure burned with the worlds that trusted it, humanity was the only civilization that had planned for what came next. And the Council finally understood the cost of its greatest miscalculation. The balance of power had not collapsed because of the Dominion. It collapsed because the system that enforced it could not survive a threat that refused to play by its rules. And the only species ready for that reality was the one that had learned to live without balance at all. They believed humanity would respond the same way. Humanity did not. The reply arrived without ceremony. No accusations. No references to sanctions or isolation. Just confirmation that the data had been received, and a precise, clinical breakdown of where the Council's projections failed. The analysis was devastating in its calm. Invasion vectors underestimated. Response times overstated. Defensive assumptions invalid. Humanity did not question if the Council would lose. They explained when. Then came the decision. Not a speech. Not a declaration. A single sentence. We will decide when to act. No conditions followed. No request for authority. No demand for apology. Just resolve. The chamber erupted. Delegates shouted about moral obligation and collective extinction. Some accused humanity of cruelty. Others of arrogance. A few tried to reassert authority, invoking charters, emergency powers, and sanctions that now sounded like echoes from a broken past. Humanity did not respond. They didn't need to, because authority ceases to exist the moment it is ignored. Within hours, deep space observatories began reporting anomalies along the edges of human-controlled space. Not weapons fire. Not fleet mobilization. Something quieter. Gravitational sensors detected rhythmic distortions, too precise to be natural. Navigation beacons recalibrated themselves without instruction. Light bent at subtle, impossible angles, as if the structure of space were being adjusted rather than disturbed. Council engineers blamed calibration drift. They were wrong. Independent traders reported vast silhouettes appearing briefly beyond sensor resolution, too large to classify, too controlled to dismiss. Not fleets assembling, but structures aligning. Patterns forming across regions too vast to be coincidence. Humanity was not rushing to war. They were positioning. A final transmission arrived, short, unencrypted, unmistakably human. Any engagement with the Dominion would occur on human terms. Timing, location, and scope would be determined by human command. Council authorization was unnecessary. Oversight would not be accepted. This was not a threat. It was a boundary. For the first time in its history, the Galactic Council confronted a truth it could not debate away. Humanity did not need its permission, did not fear its displeasure, did not confuse urgency with obligation. As the chamber dissolved into chaos, something unexpected happened on the invasion front. The Dominion slowed. Not halted. Not repelled. Just slowed. Enough for their commanders to notice inconsistencies in predictive models that had never failed before. Enough to sense resistance before it appeared. Somewhere beyond the reach of Council authority, something vast finished aligning. Space itself began to tremble. Humanity had not yet acted, but the galaxy already understood what the Council had only just realized. Balance does not collapse when authority fails loudly. It collapses when someone no longer waits for permission to act. And humanity had just made it clear they would act when they decided the moment had arrived. The Dominion never identified the start of the war. There was no surge in subspace. No spike in energy signatures. no warning cascade rippling through their sensors. One moment, Dominion armadas advanced through conquered systems with mechanical certainty, formations perfected through centuries of uncontested expansion. The next moment, space was no longer empty. Human fleets emerged in perfect silence. They did not arrive from anywhere. There was no translation flare, no rupture, no distortion announcing their presence. They simply resolved into existence, vast shapes unfolding from the dark as if reality itself had accepted them as inevitable. Massive, precise, unstoppable. The formations violated every tactical doctrine the Dominion possessed. They were not arrayed for assault, not spread for intimidation. They occupied exact positions across light minutes of space, sealing vectors before Dominion commanders understood those vectors mattered. This was not a battle line. It was containment. Dominion sensors struggled to reconcile the data. Targeting solutions lagged behind reality. Command algorithms recalculated endlessly, unable to explain how an opposing force of that scale had appeared without triggering a single early warning threshold. Before a firing order could be issued, every channel ignited at once. Primary command bands, encrypted tactical relays, emergency fallback frequencies, even internal coordination networks believed to be unreachable. One message crossed every protocol simultaneously. Stand down. It was not amplified. It carried no threat. It carried certainty. The Dominion fired. They always did. The opening volley never reached its targets. Human defenses did not intercept the energy. They absorbed it. Layered fields reshaped in real time, bending and redistributing force across systems designed to endure punishment rather than resist it. Power that should have shattered any known shield simply vanished into controlled dissipation. The Dominion adapted instantly. They never fired again. Across the invasion fleet, weapon systems desynchronized by fractions of a second, imperceptible individually, catastrophic together. Power grids slipped out of phase. Reactors throttled to emergency limits. Shields collapsed inward, not destroyed, but rendered inert. Drives failed. Thousands of ships went dead in space. Alive. Intact. Helpless. Humanity had not attacked the fleet. They had removed its ability to fight. Dominion command structures unraveled in moments. Emergency protocols refused to execute. Self-destruct systems failed silently. Engineers flooded dead channels, unable to understand why the redundancies they trusted most had turned against them. Human systems were not overpowering Dominion technology. They were exploiting it. They reached into assumptions so fundamental the Dominion had never thought to protect them. Dependencies that functioned flawlessly against weaker civilizations and catastrophically against an opponent that had built everything around resilience instead of dominance. Then one human vessel moved. It advanced alone, gliding forward with deliberate calm. Its hull bore no insignia, no declaration of authority. Just a presence so controlled it felt inevitable. It transmitted once more. This conflict is concluded. There were no demands. No negotiations. The statement was final. As the signal propagated through Dominion command networks, fleets in neighboring systems halted mid-advance. Slave transports powered down. Occupation forces abandoned positions without orders, uncertain whether movement itself would trigger the same silent neutralization. The war ended before the enemy understood it had begun. Only then did humanity acknowledge the galaxy. A single open transmission, brief, factual, and devoid of triumph. The threat had been neutralized. Hostilities were concluded. No territory had changed hands. Humanity had not come to conquer. They had come to end the war. Council observers watched in stunned silence as Dominion armadas drifted powerless in the dark, entire fleets undone without spectacle, without devastation, without permission. And in that moment, the truth became unavoidable. The balance of power had not shifted. It had collapsed. Because the balance only works when everyone agrees to play by it. And humanity had just proven that against preparation, patience, and resolve, even empires built to conquer could be stopped without ever being fought. The Council tried to reclaim control. Emergency sessions were convened in rapid succession. Ancient charters were retrieved and quoted as if age itself could restore authority. Committees were formed to investigate humanity's actions, to define jurisdiction, to reassert oversight over a galaxy that no longer waited to be governed. The galaxy listened. Then it moved on. It was too late. Because control does not return once it has been revealed to be optional. Worlds rebuilt without council authorization. Defense agreements formed laterally, between neighbors who had watched procedure fail while systems burned. Trade resumed along routes humanity had stabilized, not the carefully regulated corridors the Council once enforced. The Council still existed, but it no longer decided what happened next. Humanity did not rule the galaxy. They refused every offer of permanent leadership, declined seats of expanded authority, ignored proposals to restructure galactic governance around them. They claimed no territory, imposed no laws, demanded no tribute. They simply stepped back, not into isolation, but into readiness. Human fleets dispersed into the dark in patterns no strategist could reliably predict. They did not loom over capitals or patrol borders. They positioned themselves near fracture points, regions where history showed systems failed first and consequences spread fastest. Always distant, always present, never demanding obedience. Slowly, the galaxy understood what humanity had become. Not conquerors, not rulers, a contingency. When disputes flared, humanity did not intervene. When old empires tested one another's resolve, humanity remained silent. They issued no threats. They promised no protection. Their existence alone changed behavior. Former Dominion commanders, those few left alive and unbound, spoke quietly among themselves. Not of human weapons, but of human restraint. Of fleets that could have erased them and chose instead to end the war cleanly, decisively, and without spectacle. That restraint carried more weight than fear ever could. The Council issued one final declaration, warning that a galaxy without centralized authority would descend into chaos. Few listened. Fewer believed it. Because the galaxy had learned something the Council never had. Stability enforced by tradition fails. Stability enforced by readiness endures. Humanity had proven that leadership was not inherited through age, charters, or unanimous votes. It emerged from preparation, from competence, from the willingness to act when action was required, and the discipline to stop when it was not. So the galaxy adapted. It always does. And somewhere beyond the bright halls where authority once lived, humanity watched the stars in silence. Not from thrones. Not from councils. From the dark. Humanity did not rule the galaxy. They had no desire to. They had simply proven a truth no civilization could afford to forget. If darkness rises again, if something worse comes out of the void, if the galaxy hesitates when it matters most, humanity will be there. Not to command, not to conquer, but to make sure there is still a galaxy left when the darkness falls.